Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name is Lili Wilkinson. I'm an author and academic. This afternoon session is on Rolf de Heer's wonderful film, The Old Man Who Read Love Stories. And here to chat to me about it is Josh Nelson. Josh is a writer, academic, broadcaster and filmmaker. He teaches, writes and podcasts about film, as well as appearing regularly on Triple R and 774 ABC Radio. Please join me in making him welcome.
Thanks. Cheers.
All right, so I think what we'll start with, I confess that I didn't see this film when it came out. And so what struck me about it as I was kind of viewing it for the first time was how kind of thematically strong a film it is. And I sort of have broken it down into 4 thematic kind of conflicts or tensions, which I've started to make me feel something about the structure of film makes me feel very organised. So that is how I'm going to kind of break this down. So we'll talk about each of these sort of tensions. And the first one I came up with is sort of very much linked to sort of the space and place of the film. And so it's sort of looking at both village versus jungle and sort of linked to that barbarity versus civilization. So let's talk about how this film looks and where it is set.
I think, just to touch on the strength of this film in terms of the dichotomies and the conflicts in it, this is what really struck me. And when they announced this text for Year 12 a couple of years ago, I was, because I had vague memories of seeing it at the cinema on its very limited release in 2004, and thinking, really, they've picked this film? That seems quite strange. And then rewatching it, it struck me how strong and complex and really sophisticated the film is, not just in terms of the filmic language. I'm sure we'll talk about this, and this is my bugbear for students as well. Make sure you reference the filmic language, the shots, the composition, the style, not just talk about the plot and the dialogue. But these dichotomies, like the barbarity and humanity, the gender conflicts, the past and present. I'm sure we'll get to some of these. Maybe these are on your list.
Totally on my list.
But space is really so important, and I think that the opening of this film is really crucial in setting up the relationship of space to character. So we have this. I'm hoping some of you have seen it. I'll try and describe it. Otherwise, the opening credits, it opens with a book turning. So we get a voiceover narration, and then the book dissolves into basically the world of the jungle and the river, and we follow this sort of almost point of view shot of a boat travelling down this river, with the voiceover about the lead character, Antonio Bolivar, played by Richard Dreyfuss. And we get these superimpositions of his sort of life up until this point, to the backstory overlaid over the jungle and the water. So it sets up this relationship of this man to the jungle, this story that we get of him being out of place, that he'd come from a very sort of farming rural area, and now he's a settler basically with his wife. And the way in which he slowly integrates. And as the dissolves bring us up to a present, we see him moving through the jungle, and we see then it finally the boat comes to rest on his hut. And the hut, the image of the hut that we get at that very opening of the film, I think really sums up Antonio's relationship to so much of what goes on in this film, because he's outside of the main settlement area. His hut is sort of half buried in the trees of the jungle, and we find out later that he's built the hut. But, of course, the evil character in this, the mayor, holds it over him, and he says he owns the land that the hut's built on, and he uses this to sort of bribe him later in the film. So we get this sense of this character in a space of limbo, basically, where he's sort of in between the jungle, he's in between the jungle and civilization, he's in between the past and the present. So all that sort of rich just visual information just from that opening credit sequence tells us so much. And this character, I think what makes him such a fascinating character is the way he's constantly torn between these various conflicts that the film then plays out. Yep,
absolutely. And I think that the film raises some really interesting kind of questions about what it means to be civilized and what it means to be barbaric, and we would certainly, from a Western perspective, assume that it is, the Western settlers that would be bringing civilization to these kind of wild savages. And at first you start to think, well, no, that's obviously absolutely not true, because, it is very clear from the beginning of the film that most of the white people are kind of horrible, and that the native people are incredibly, they're very noble. They walk upright through the jungle. They're clean, which I think is really interesting. That the gringos are all sort of filthy, but they're the little red, whatever you call them,
native attire
is always just completely spotless. But then that occasionally kind of gets turned back again, and we see that really all of these people are barbaric in some ways.
Yeah, I think you're right. And when you start watching this, there's a tendency, and I think this is an issue for students as well who are studying this, to divide the characters into the film in that really neat division between the Western sort of colonialists and the settlers as being the evil force, and the natives in the jungle as being the natural and positive force. But I think that's a really overly simplistic way of reading it. And I think the film is aware to avoid the noble savagery or the image of the noble savage as the film goes on. And there's a great moment later on, and it's just in a small flashback, where Nushino, the leader of the Shuar tribespeople that Antonio sort of falls in with, they're walking through the jungle, and he blow darts a sloth and kills it. And Antonio says, why have you killed it? He says, that's what we've always done. They all look the same to us. So you get this one moment of barbarity, this sort of senseless violence. So I think that's quite a clever and important scene, because it suggests that, one of the themes in this is that all men or all humanity is capable of barbarity. So it's a way of the film bypassing this idea of, the savages are great and the settlers are evil. So I think there's a complexity to this film that you don't always get with those types of relationships.
Yeah, and I sort of really like the juxtaposition of that scene with killing the sloth, along with that horrific scene where all of the prospectors come and they're all caked in mud, and they ask the dentist, they explain to the dentist they've got this bet going on that if he can pull out all of this one guy's teeth and he doesn't make a sound, then the prospectors will give them all of their gold. And it's sort of like, the whole purpose of you guys being out in this horrible place is to have the gold. And the fact that they're willing to give that up just to be able to witness this incredible act of brutality, is awful.
Particularly that final image of the guy after he's had all his teeth. It's a wonder why I don't go to the dentist after seeing this film so many times. I tell you, the final image is this grimace, this almost smile of this toothless man with blood sort of caked around the outside of his mouth, sort of laughing hysterically. And that image really sums up the senseless barbarity of the settlers. And there's some lovely shots during that sequence where you have the gold, which is the booty for whoever wins the bet, on this table. And he with each teeth that the Hugo Weaving, the mad dentist character, pulls out, he lays it beside the gold. So this juxtaposition of extraction, the extraction of the teeth with the extraction of the natural resources from the world, but also the way in which that scene takes place within the narrative. The flashback is triggered by a moment on the hunting expedition where the mayor loses a boot in a sort of a water hole and starts to senselessly just trying to grab it out, and the Dreyfus character says, look, I'm sure that's where scorpions nest. I wouldn't be putting a hand in there. And of course the scorpion emerges and the mayor fires his weapon. It's a complete act of sort of ridiculous violence, trying to shoot a scorpion in a water hole. And that triggers this moment, this flashback. And so you get that contrast between the past and the present, this idea of the barbarity repeating itself, and where those memory triggers and those flashbacks happen in the narrative are really crucial, because they're almost always on a pointed thematic link. And of course, when we come back to the present after this horrific dental scene, that we see the scorpion emerge from the water hole and crawl away, and it's, he's just fired his entire, weapon at this thing, and it's meant nothing. Nature sort of triumphs in the end. And
I think that what you were saying before about Antonio sort of being sort of outside both of these worlds is kind of, again, there's a bit of a reflection of that scene when he finds the body of another prospector outside the store, and he finds that little bag of jewels, which is sort of very reminiscent to the bag of gold that the prospectors are offering for their bet, and instead of keeping it, he just throws it away because he doesn't want more prospectors to come, because he realises that they're just, screwing everything up. It's a really sad moment. It's the moment where you get, I think, one of the greatest senses of the shared identification between Antonio and the I was going to say the Jaguar. It's his accent in the film. The Jaguar that they're hunting, because as he's throwing each of these gems that this dead prospector has obviously stolen or taken, he keeps naming off, like, the tourists and the settlers and the prospectors, and you get this sense of the impending doom of maybe nature hasn't really got a chance here. Mm-hmm. And he finishes by saying, "You're done for, cat. So am I." And there's almost that really melancholic sensibility, and that, I think the film develops that idea of, there's a kind of a bond that's captured in that moment between Antonio and the Jaguar. Mm. So let's talk about Antonio. Yep. We're moving on to my second thematic tension, which is men versus women and hunter versus prey. I love Antonio. He's great. Richard Dreyfuss's performance is extraordinary.
It is, yep.
And I suppose the thing I love the most about this character is how in some ways he's very innocent, but he's never foolish.
Yep. I think that's a really good way of putting it. He does seem like a child, and one of the key themes that the film expresses through his sort of coming of age is the theme of reading. That it's through his ability to read, not just books, the love stories from the title, but to read people, to read situations, to read the natural world, that we get a sense of his, he of all the characters, with the exception of perhaps Nushino, the tribe's leader, he's the best at reading the environment, the scenario, and he's such a lovely character in that regard, because you get that wonderful balance, like you said, between that naivety and his sort of the knowledgeable, sort of wise older man.
Definitely. And so let's talk about the Jaguar, and what she symbolises.
Well, this is another thing, particularly for students, that I think is important. That it's very difficult to analyse this film without engaging the gender politics of the film, particularly given the conflicts that we mentioned before, particularly the civilization or the civilised world and the natural world, because the world of Iladilio, which is the name of the settlement, which is clearly ironic because it's run down and decaying and filthy, so it's not idyllic at all, is run by this sort of very patriarchal figure of the mayor, this grotesque, obese, misogynist figure. And then on the other hand, you get the natural world, which is being under attack, or it's being ruled by the figure of the Jaguar, which is a female Jaguar. And they make the point at one stage where her cubs have been killed, and so has her partner. Her partner has obviously been wounded because the father's duty in the law of the jungle is to mind the cubs, and it's the female who goes out hunting. So you have this kind of complete opposition between the threatening female and threatening female sexuality versus the patriarchal world of the settlement. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think the other thing that I think is worth noting of these types of films, because in a sense it's a monster movie. There's a genre kind of feel to this film as well. It's like Jaws or The Birds. It's nature attacking society. So what does the Jaguar symbolise? Is it nature's revenge? Is it the revenge of the various females in the film? The few we see are either sort of locked inside, imprisoned prostitutes, browbeaten wives, or I think the Jaguar can symbolise very different things, or even Antonio's past as well, which again because he's lost his wife that they first settled there with. So is it his wife Dolores taking her kind of revenge for him bringing her to the jungle?
Yeah, I think that's really correct in that the gender politics of the film is incredibly important, and even though there are not actually a lot of women in the film, the sort of presence is very I suppose the women, for me, sort of represent a certain wildness, and sort of seem very comfortable in the jungle. Like Josephina seems much more comfortable in her surroundings than the mayor does.
Yep. Yeah, Josephine is a fascinating character, because when we first introduced to her, she's seen as the mayor's servant, I guess, who he makes money off for sexual activities. We get the sense of, we don't sort of really see that in the film, who starts this bond with Antonio over the shared love of reading, and then that reading becomes a kind of a more romantic relationship between the two of them. But one of the questions I often ask students is, how do they view her character? And does she have any agency or power? Because pretty much she's locked inside the mayor's residence, and then when she's relocates to Antonio, again, she's only really seen indoors. So in one sense, I think you could see her just moving from one sort of form of imprisonment to another potentially. But the key thing I don't think you can undervalue here is that she opens the narrative. It's her voice that gives rise to Antonio's story. So in one sense, she's also the narrator, and I think that gives her an incredible sense of power because she basically frames Antonio's story. So it sort of raised that question of who's controlling who in terms of the film's playing on personality and subject and identity.
Absolutely. And I think you could also argue that as in some ways she's the keeper of knowledge. She is the one who has all of the romance novels, and so she's sort of this like a gatekeeper in a lot of ways, and that she in some ways, she saves Antonio's life.
Completely the mentor. I mean, even in a practical level, she's the one who buys him the reading glass, which becomes so important later on in the film, not only because it allows him to read, and there's that lovely moment where he says, tell her thank you because I can read till I'm 100 now. But it's the device that he uses at the end of the film where he throws away the white man's weapon of the gun when he has to have the confrontation with the Jaguar, and reconstructs the Shuar blowpipe, the weapon of the natives that he'll use to kill the Jaguar. And of course, there's these lovely shots of him making the pipes, but we can see him trying to intricately create them under the reading glass. So again, that this symbolism that recurs where reading is related to the jungle, and it's sort of I guess the way in which he identifies with the Jaguar.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so thematic tension number 3 is honour versus dishonour, past versus present, and guilt versus redemption. So how do you... It's just a few.
Just a few.
Chucked in there. Let's talk about the way that the film uses flashbacks to be able to tell its story.
Structure is incredibly important for this film because, like you said, the role of the way flashbacks slowly emerge and in glimpses. So while we're being told Antonio's story from the narration from the outset, even though that disappears as a technique and we move into the world of the film, we're getting Antonio's world in the present, but we also get these glimpses of this backstory, which start to give us a sense of understanding of what has brought him to this point in the film. So in a sense, the film is structured like a book that you need to kind of slowly gather the pieces, the small bits of information, and it's only at the end that you get the whole picture. And it's only at the end where we get the entirety of the sort of the flashback, the key moment of Antonio's life, which is, of Nushino has been wounded by a prospector, and his sort of dying wish is that Antonio will kill him sort of as an act of, I guess, sort of vengeance, but that will allow Nushino's spirit to pass into the afterworld properly. But he has to kill him properly, and he doesn't. He uses the white man's weapon of the gun, which damns Nushino to eternal misery. But of course we don't get this. We get these glimpses of Nushino appearing in flashbacks or superimpositions, saying things like, "Bad way to go, my friend." So it's this sort of spirit guide which is like haunts the narrative. But really what the importance of, I guess, that flashback structure is, it's for me, it's Antonio's past impinging on his present. So the film uses that technique of structure to comment on the theme of memory and the relationship between past and present. And it does so in a real kind of kaleidoscope of techniques. So we get the one moment where he's talking about his wife Dolores and how he brought her to the jungle, and he picks up a photograph, and the photograph comes to life in his hands, and then it moves into the photograph, and we get this moment where he tries to kiss her, and she says, "Those kisses are sinful," which I love that line. So that's one way where, in a filmmaking sense, what the film is saying by using that kind of technique, it's saying that the past is actually present in the present. I know it's a complicated way of saying it, but the past is still alive for Antonio, and that happens time and again. We get memories that emerge out of a swirl in the river or out of picking up an object. So for Antonio, his entire world is related to his past and his memories, and it's not just the idea of memory in this film is not just one that's embedded in a kind of a consciousness or a psychology, but it's in the natural world as well. So there's one moment, and again, the emphasis on film techniques, we get this slow tracking shot which moves into his face and then dissolves into a flashback, and at the end the camera then reverses out. So this idea of we've gone inside his head and now we're retreating. But then later the camera work is reversed. So there's a moment where he's sitting in the dark in the campfire, and the camera moves away from him into the natural world where the memory sort of takes place, and then it comes back. So it sort of suggests, that camera movement's reversed, but it suggests that the memory actually is in the natural world itself. I'm crossing themes here, I'm sorry, but
no, that's fine.
For me, it's past and present is always present in the filmic techniques, but in a variety of ways, in objects, in the past.
And I think that it's really it's important that these are not just flashbacks for us. Like, it's not just creating the story by telling the audience what happened before, that these are actually, we get to see Antonio remember these things. We get to see, that he's so kind of taken back into these times and these memories that, that he, walks into people and stops listening, and that, so we see that it is really consuming him.
Yeah, it's another instance where Antonio is a man living in a limbo state. He's caught between the past and the present. The past kind of haunts him, and it's really not until he can kind of deal with the past and make up for the sins of the past that maybe in the end he has a kind of a future or a present. But that constant sort of almost attempt to reconcile those worlds is one of the real driving kind of conflicts and dramas, I think, in this film, which makes it so watchable. And there's so many kind of different levels at which those memories take place and continue to work. And even just on a really sort of superficial level, the film plays on repetition elsewhere. So not just on this idea of memory, but he tells a story about the first time he tried to catch a jaguar. And he's around a campfire. It's this very sort of intimate moment. And then he says, and I fell asleep. And I'm not sure how it ends. And then we get to see he uses the same technique at the end of the film. So it's like history repeats itself again. And even on a really superficial level, when he tries to read words, he almost reads everything 3 times. So there's a great moment where he picks up a can of sardines, and the first time he tries to read it, it's this sort of almost foreign elongated vowels where it's like sardines, and it makes no sense. But by the 3rd time he says sardines, and he talks about you have to kind of go over it a number of times to make sense of it. And I think that's what he does with the past. He's processing it over and again until he can kind of come to terms with it, make sense with it.
Absolutely, and he certainly does that when he's reading this sort of, again, that sort of beautiful scene where he puzzles out the first few words of his new book and then sort of gets there and he's like, okay, now we've got to figure out what any of that meant.
Yep.
Because the first sort of bit is let's go and talk about the reading now, because for me, this was sort of one of the most sort of powerful parts of the film, and it's not something you'd necessarily expect from a film about, an old guy in a jungle hunting a jaguar. You don't really expect it to also be about romance novels. So I suppose thing number 4 is reality versus fiction. What is it about reading that is so important to Antonio?
I think it's about empathy and identification. I think the film is also careful, and I think students need to be aware of this, that it's not just reading, because the film makes a really important point of distinction between reading anything, so like things like newspapers. There's a scene where one of the first items he reads is this awful sort of tabloid newspaper, and the front page story is a man who's stabbed his best friend a number of times, and we see Antonio, and the look of the film in those flashbacks where we see him in that state is this cold, drab, empty shack of him sitting alone, kind of hunched shoulders, and he puts the newspaper aside and he says, well, if that's reading, I'm glad I never sort of started it. And then they contrast that where he starts reading the romance novels, the love stories, and everything changes. The mise-en-scène is this brightly warm lit. He's now sort of, we see these shots of him lying in a hammock, this contrast. And I think the key there is that there's something about love stories which promotes a sense of empathy and identification. And of course we see that reflecting, the world of the novels reflecting the real world with his relationship with Josephina. So it doesn't just become about identifying with people and characters. It becomes a way of him sharing those experiences with someone real, with Josephina. And those shots we see towards the end of the film where they're reading together. So it's not even about one man and his novels. It's about sharing it, and there's something sharing what's going on in the text, but also on a personal level. His focus
on that last line of that book about it was a kiss of impassioned intensity, and those words, and he seemed so puzzled by them at first, and he kept saying impassioned intensity sort of over and over again, and we get the feeling that this is something that Antonio has never felt before. You get the feeling that impassioned intensity, he's never had a kiss like that, but I don't even know if he's ever felt like that about anything before. And do you think that these books kind of unlock some of those emotions for him?
There's definitely a sense of yearning that it brings out. And again, the film plays on with these flashbacks or these moments where we get his imagination kind of come through into the imagery of the world. Are these events that have happened, or are these his fantasies, particularly at the beginning of the film where he's reading these lines and then he stops and he's thinking impassioned intensity. And we get this moment of him kissing Josephina. And at that point, is he remembering a kiss that's actually happened, or how he'd like it to happen? And then he poses it in relation to different characters. So he says, Rubicondo, the dashing Hugo Weaving dentist character, I'm sure he's had plenty of kisses, but maybe not like this. And then the Shuar tribespeople, there was plenty of passion, but no kissing. So again, that just sort of his process of identification, and of course the yearning that then becomes connected to Josephina. And I think reading becomes his weapon. I probably should have mentioned this before, but there's a great scene where they're on the expedition and they're in Alka-Seltzer's hut, this sort of halfway place that they go to, with sort of supply store, and the camera moves around the hut to all the hunters and the inhabitants, and each one is like sharpening a machete, polishing their gun, or playing with some kind of weapon, and then the camera comes to rest on Antonio and he's assembling the reading glass. So we get this contrast between the violence of all these other men and his weapon, which is, this wonderful kind of contraption that allows him to enter the world of love stories. And of course you have that nice refrain where that man says, "I never saw the point of it myself, why do you do it?"
Richard Dreyfuss says in the featurette that goes in the DVD that he thinks that Antonio kind of understands that the world is much, much bigger than him, which is something that perhaps a lot of the other characters in the book do not understand, and that his feelings about that and his feelings about the world and his place in it are so kind of big and sort of difficult to grasp that he can only understand them through this sort of the epicness and purple prose of romance literature, that because those feelings are also so big that are happening in there, that it sort of gives him a lens to look at the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. And even the kind of the foreign settings of them give him a chance to try. I mean, he's so hungry for information. He's like a kid who's just discovered reading for the first time. There's that moment where he's talking about, he's reading the scene of the couple on the gondola, he calls it. And then there's a moment where he's with the mayor and he's having a conversation about something completely unrelated, and he sees this sort of half-submerged boat, and he says, "It's like a gondola." Sort of trying to prompt, trying to get information back. Is this what a gondola actually looks like? And of course, then the
mayor's like, "No, you idiot."
It has a bigger prow, and and he's like, and you see that. Okay, good. Now I can picture what a gondola actually looks like. But he has that sense of the broader context, and I think that comes as well in the film from having spent time with the Shuar tribes, understanding their worldview, and also having a completely kind of intimate understanding of the colonialist kind of perspective. I mean, he was a settler, so he comes from, he's caught between these two worlds.
I want to talk just a little bit about the mayor and Rubicundo, because they are both completely awesome characters. And I think they're both very similar, and in some ways I kind of think they're two sides of the same coin. They're both use Josephina in immoral kind of ways.
Agreed.
They're both very mocking of religion in various different ways. When the mayor is sort of performing last rites, he's like something, and the rest
Domine
of it.
Padre, something like that, and then kicks a body into the river.
Yeah, and Rubicundo, obviously, when Antonio asks for a Bible, he's like, "No, you don't want that, it'll rot your brain." They're both greedy, and we can see that, Rubicundo agrees to the bet of pulling out all of that guy's teeth in order for half the gold, in exchange for half the gold. So why is it that we hate the mayor so much, but we really kind of are rooting a little bit for the dentist?
Oh, well, one, that they set the dentist up as being the kind of the best friend, the free-loving sort of best friend of Antonio. And there's a sense of compassion and understanding that the dentist has, despite his... I think a lot of Hugo Weaving's performance suggests that it is a performance, that he's playing a kind of character, he's playing the Don Juan of the Amazon, but really he's actually sort of far more down to earth. But you're right, there is a real similarity, particularly at the level of they both exist in this sort of hedonistic world, whether it's sex or whether it's booze or, or whatever. But where that key point of distinction comes with that discussion about the barbarity of man. And he says the mayor's justification for why he thinks he's not a barbarian is, "I'm educated, I'm the mayor, I can't be a barbarian." And then, as one of the other men rightly points out, well, the dentist is educated as well, and the dentist chimes in, "Yeah, and that doesn't make me any less of a barbarian." So he's aware of his own role in this whole sort of situation, and I think maybe that kind of gives him a different sensibility. I mean, the mayor is so ignorant and so headstrong, but I do love the way the mayor decays, like everything else in the film. He decays. That one of the earliest flashbacks we see, he's in this sort of perfect, immaculate uniform when he's rigging the election that gets him voted in. But when we see him in the present, he's this obese figure where his stomach sort of falls out over his, and he's always sweating, and he's such a grotesque kind of figure, and so incongruous within the jungle setting compared to the other men, and particularly the Shuar tribespeople. So whereas, I think Rubicondo is far more stable in his appearance.
Yeah, definitely. All right. It's time to open up the floor. If any of you guys have any comments or questions, we would love to hear them.
I haven't seen the film, and I'm just wondering if it's available, because now you've got me interested, except I'm very nervous about the dentist. So.
Just close your eyes.
Yes.
It is. It's a Madman DVD, so you should just be able to buy it from anywhere, but you can definitely buy it online from Madman.
Yeah, it disappeared for a while, but I think when it popped up on the Year 12 Filmers text a couple of years ago, they kind of went, oh, actually, this is going to be in demand. So now it's far more readily available. Most of the shops in the city have it, particularly around the time that students need to be getting copies to watch for their exams and their essays.
It's a good DVD as well, because there is a making of featurette and a Q&A with Rolf de Heer and Hugo Weaving, which I learned a lot of things from.
Rolf de Heer is such a fascinating director, and this film, for those of you who haven't seen it, has a kind of interesting production background. I think this says a lot about, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but the Australian film industry. And this is a film that he needed to get funding from overseas investors. I think there was some French, there may have been some Japanese or German investors.
Definitely
Dutch. And the film was filmed and produced in 1999, and then it sat on a shelf for 5 years. And when it finally got released in 2004, it was this tiny sort of theatrical release, which I think is a real shame. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with this, which is kind of nice that it's got at least some kind of rebirth in the Year 12 or a kind of the education setting. But yeah, it's what is it about these kinds of films that are challenging, that are clever and sophisticated, that sort of just fall by the wayside? This is a film that shouldn't have sort of suffered that fate.
Yeah, in the Q&A, Rolf de Heer has sort of a very long and purposefully vague story of the production, which involves all sorts of studios being sold to other people, and then they had to wait for 2 years until the film depreciated in value enough to be able to be sold to somebody. Anyway, it was all very unpleasant and money related.
And he had Final Cut too. That was one of the other key things. He said he had to have, creative control over the final cut of the film, which is good, because some of the suggestions about how the film could have ended would have been quite awful. And I think it's interesting too, knowing some of the differences between the Louis Sepulveda novel, or the short story novella that the film was based on. He does make a number of creative differences, which I think really work, particularly given what he's trying to do. Like we've talked about, the emphasis on reading and the connection and the sort of the spirituality of the film.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, just the microphone.
There is another Dutch filmmaker in Melbourne too. What's his name again? And he has these very unusual films too. One is called something with
Paul Cox, I think someone said.
Paul Cox, yes. Now, I just find that interesting that there is these two Dutch people in Melbourne.
Well, Paul Cox has had a similar sort of career. It's always been on the fringes of the mainstream.
Yes.
And he's treated a number of really diverse kind of subjects as well, Paul Cox, and that really characterises Rolf de Heer's filmmaking. I mean, he's had some modicum of success with films like 10 Canoes, which was a really, I guess, important film, and The Tracker. But Bad Boy Bubby, these sort of almost cult films, these real sort of spread. He did that short film with Magda Szubanski, the silent film, which came out quite a few years ago now, which is quite interesting, given everyone sort of championed The Artist when that came out as, oh look, it's the first film to kind of bring back the silent film, and it's like, well, Rolf de Heer did that 10 years ago. Yep, nice try. But maybe it is that European influence, and I think you see that in this film. It's not a typical, I don't even know if it would be typically classified as an Australian film if it weren't for his role as the director and maybe the presence of Hugo Weaving. It treats the natural world in a different way to, say, the Australian outback, I think. There's definitely I'm not sure, it's spirituality is not the right word, but there's...
It has a very kind of South American magic realism feel to it.
Definitely, yeah.
And it is not... one of the things that really struck me is that apart from sort of the very, very early scene where, I suppose early chronologically, not necessarily in the film, where Antonio gets bitten by a snake, I think that apart from that, the jungle is actually seen as being very kind of... It's not harsh, it's not forbidding, it doesn't even really feel very dangerous. in the way that the Australian outback often is.
That's true. Yeah, that's really true. There's a beautiful sensibility, and again, the importance of place and space in these films is used to draw distinctions between characters, because we see like the Shuar tribes people almost moving seamlessly through the jungle, and then of course you get the contrast with the white settlers when they go on the hunting expedition, and they're bulky and they're kind of stumbling around, and they're ill prepared and they don't know where to camp, and it plays upon or it uses space in a really interesting way. And there's some lovely, and again, filmic language, filmic techniques, wonderful high angle wide shots of these men sort of walking through this jungle, and they're tiny, they're like ants, and again I think it emphasises their isolation, the fact they're sort of disempowered and the jungle is really in control. It gives the jungle has such a wonderful sense of character. And same with the river, and we talked about the dichotomy of themes and the conflicts. The river is this perfect kind of setting, this perfect metaphor for that, because it divides these two lands, and there's a moment towards the end of the film where we get the Shuar tribespeople on one side, and we get the prospectors who are sort of using dynamite to explode a dam on the other, and we have the river in the middle, and we get this perfect sense of this is the two worlds, and the river is what sort of divides them, and the river is often associated with death in this film.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
Hi. We're Year 12s, actually studying the text for
Yay!
our exam at the end of the year, and we were just wondering what parts of the film you think that people often forget, and
good question,
that could help us stand out, I guess.
What are the key moments or key scenes that people forget? I think the moment of the sloth, so that refrain where the Shuar killed the sloth, I think that's a key moment, because of the way it comes back to that theme of the barbarity of man, and it doesn't try and draw distinctions between the natives and the settlers. So it's just a sort of small moment that I think could be easily forgotten. But there is so many small moments in the filmic language and the way this film was edited and shot that I think take on a heightened importance. It's a really sophisticated film in many ways. So the setup for one of the sequences where Antonio is getting ready to read the novel, and he's in his hut, and it's at night, and he opens the page, and we see him light the lamp and pour a little shot of rum, and we get these glimpses in these really sort of extreme close-ups. And then at the end of the scene we get the whole context. We get the mid-shot, which shows all these pieces and the setting. And I think that editing sequence, the small glimpses of information, the close-ups, and then the bigger picture, is really what the film does, on a broader narrative sense. It gives us these glimpses of character, of backstory, of kind of imagery, and then at the end, it's like the whole thing sort of comes full circle and we get the bigger picture. So really think about those small details in the filmic language that I think students often forget. And I think even as viewers, you don't even need to be studying this film to forget about it. I think often when we're watching films, we're not thinking about how films are edited, particularly if the storytelling is that good, that we're inside the world of the film. But from a critical sort of analytical point, I think it's that the emphasis is on going back and rethinking how did the filmmaker construct that language? What is it that gives us that extra insight or sophistication into the world of these characters and the themes?
Yep.
Hi. I haven't seen the film, but Rolf de Heer is one of my very favourite directors, and Hugo Weaving, of course, is a consummate actor. So this has tempted me to really go and get the DVD of it. My question is, given the history of the film and how it had that sort of, the hiatus where it wasn't actually recognised, is there a story behind how it became listed on the VCE list of reading?
If there is, I don't know what it is.
No, I think the film that it replaced 2 or 3 years ago, now this is the third year I think it's been running, was Look Both Ways, the Australian film, the wonderful Australian film. I love teaching that as well. But I think there was a sense of to take one off, that the film that should follow that or replace it on the syllabus should have some kind of Australian attachment. That's my thinking. I'm sort of just speaking from an outside perspective, but I think that might have been one of the justifications because of the Rolf de Heer, the Hugo Weaving, and the themes that this film engages, particularly the relationship between settlers and a native population, are quite relevant to this country as well, and are really fruitful in a classroom discussion setting. I think that they were the sorts of issues that probably led to this film being selected.
On the making of thing, they talk a lot about what a multicultural production it was, because it was there were so many different countries organised. It had to be a multilingual crew, where the crew, some of them only spoke English, some of them only spoke Spanish, some of them only spoke French. And so there was a lot of kind of cross-communication. Rolf de Heer said that he had to learn how to be a French director, and apparently French crews will only listen to you if you're screaming at them, and if you just ask them nicely to do something, they'll just think that you're being suspicious somehow. And that for production purposes, Rolf de Heer was sort of both, I think, in terms of getting funding, sort of had to be both Dutch and Australian, and Hugo Weaving had to be both English and Australian. And yeah, it was all very strange, I think. And one of the really beautiful moments is in the Q&A when Hugo Weaving is talking about that originally they were all supposed to just be using their own accents, and they weren't going to be doing the Spanish accents, and that as they got over there, they realised that some of the other actors were already Spanish and had Spanish accents. Richard Dreyfuss decided that he was going to do a Spanish accent. He'd been practising one, and he thought that, it would be much more beautiful. And he showed Rolf de Heer this beautiful Spanish accent that he does in the film, and it is beautiful. And Rolf de Heer's like, awesome, everyone's doing Spanish accents. So he went and picked up Hugo Weaving and Timothy Spall from the airport, took them to the bar, said, by the way, we're going to do it all in Spanish accents. And Timothy Spall was like, I've just done a film where I had to be Spanish. Easy. And Hugo Weaving was like, I just did a play where I was Polish.
It works.
It totally works.
Polish, Spanish. I mean, that's an interesting point of comparison between this film and, say, 10 Canoes, where the emphasis is on the authenticity of the language, that it had to be done in the native indigenous tongue. And here the natives, the indigenous Shuar tribes, speak English. Now, that's one of those sort of points of contention, I think, because of the cultural kind of baggage that comes with that sort of artistic decision, and the fact that, so many films have had that, you think about those 1930s westerns where, all the Indians are that awful kind of, which we cringe at now because that's so kind of, uncommon, or it's less common. And in one sense, it is awkward, and it's a strange decision because of his, reckoning and what he did on 10 Canoes, but I'm willing to forgive it, and I think part of that is obviously the production issues that sort of led to that, or forced them to go down that path. I don't think it would have lost anything. I think it would have probably been just as good, if not better, if they had had the native tongue, but that would have raised issues about how did Antonio's character learn these sort of dialects and so on.
Well, and not to mention the fact that if you have the native tongue being used, why isn't everyone else speaking Spanish?
Yep.
Because really nobody there would have been speaking English.
And then the film just wouldn't have got made. It wouldn't have got any funding. It struggled to get funding as it was, but trying to pitch a film, so we're going to get these characters who don't speak Spanish to speak Spanish, and this sort of native language that we may or may not know and may not be sort of regional to the era. That would have been stretching it for funding, I think.
Just as a last piece of trivia, one of the really beautiful things that I learnt in researching this film was that the guy who plays Nushino, the sort of the leader of the Shuar tribe, they found him. He's Dutch, weirdly enough, and he was sort of pitched to Rolf de Heer going, I've got this really awesome guy. He's from South America originally, but he's a Dutch actor, and but he's trained in America as an American actor, and so he saw him in a few other things, and Rolf de Heer saw that he's a great actor and he's wonderful in this film. And then when they ended up going onto location where they shot the film, it turned out that the tribe, the native people that are in the film playing their own native selves, that's actually where he's from. It's where his ancestral seat is from, and his matrilineal kind of heritage is that he actually is very high up in that tribe. So it was sort of this homecoming, and he hadn't been there since he was like 3 years old.
That's wonderful.
It was sort of one of those beautiful little pieces of filmmaking gold.
Just a quick production. Is it publicised or known as an Australian film now, all around the world?
I think it would probably be seen as an Australian co-production.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think...
But Australia would be fairly heavily featured in the publicity.
I think so.
Yeah.
Often when they decide the nationalities of certain, or the cultural sort of associations of certain films, the director comes sort of high on that. And given his association with Australia, yeah, I think it probably would be. But the money side of things, it'd probably be seen as a maybe Australian-Dutch production, Australian-German.
I think it was Australian, Dutch, French, English.
So, yeah.
Was it edited in Australia?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Well, there you go. It says on the DVD the origin is Netherlands, Spain, France, Australia.
It's a perfectly multicultural film.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming along. It's been a great session, and join me in thanking Josh.
Thanks.